for a few words, and it's actually very useful for me to improve some of my speaking pattern, which I'm sure Sharan can talk more in this demo. And the second speaker is Chia from Eventual Computing, who will talk about distributed multimodal data processing with the open source Python library for Daft. I also met Jay a few weeks ago when we exchanged information details about our work, and definitely excited to see more of the motivation as well as the technical aspect of building that. So yeah, just some logistic. Feel free to send your question on the chat if you have any, and then the speakers can answer them asynchronously when they finish with the presentation. So I know Sharan, have a meeting at like 2, so I'll let him start first, and then I'll let Jay go over there.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Share your screen and get started.
Okay, lovely. I'm gonna do a little quick chatting first, and then I'll share my screen a little bit. But hey, folks, so nice to meet you all. Again, James, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. My name is Sharan. I lead product at Yoodli. We are an AI speech coach. In a nutshell, we're building Grammarly, but for verbal speech. Our goal is to help everyone we come across speak with more confidence and clarity. And the company was started by 2 incredible founders, Isha Joshi and Varun Puri, with the goals of collectively helping immigrants, women, people of minorities, people who don't have that confidence, speak up and help people deliver things more effectively. As AI kind of takes over the world and the increasing amount of content starts to overwhelm us, we have a core belief that how we say things will really matter a lot more than what we're saying in the near future. And we realize that leveraging technology and various types of machine learning systems, we're able to help support, give insight to folks, and help them learn how they can speak a little bit better. I'd like to keep this kind of conversational. I will go through some things, but I'm going to ask for questions a bunch. Quick show of hands. Has anyone even heard of Yoodli before this? Any chance? Other than James?
No.
Okay, super. No worries then. Glad I'm able to share. Okay, let's jump right into it. So speech is interesting. And I'm sure a lot of y'all are technological practitioners, especially in the AI space, where determining an objective function is part of the core flows of building a model or building some sort of system that helps people get better. And what's challenging about speech is there's no way of really objectively saying this is good. And so Yoodli's approach has been, how can we support folks and help them walk towards where their goals are? And I'll show you where the product is today. I'll show you where the product is going, and would love to just chat about where we could go, ideas y'all may have, things that you may want to share from your experiences, and go from there. How many folks are on at least 3 to 5, maybe up to 10 meetings a week on Zoom? Raise your hands.
Hit me.
And I imagine that a lot of times these meetings are either pretty dry or not really something that you spend a lot of time focusing on or preparing for. With Yoodli, we've learned that folks, especially immigrants, people from different countries, people switching job functions from an engineer trying to become an engineering manager or a product manager, they have a lot of insecurities around how they're communicating effectively. And while they could be incredibly sharp in their domain, one of their major challenges is, how do I express what's in my head effectively to external stakeholders? And so what we found is folks will like to practice and learn and get diagnosed real time on how they're communicating. And Yoodli does just that. We've integrated a few sets of technology to create what we call Yoodli for Desktop. It's a desktop application that lives on my machine in between me, my computer, and my meeting software. In the top right corner of my screen here, you can see what it looks like. So live real time, as I'm communicating, Yoodli is giving me insight in how well I'm speaking. It's telling me I'm on a 3-minute monologue, which I certainly am right now. I've used a few filler words, and okay, which I'm conscious about because Yoodli's told me, and now I'm also conscious about the fact that I need to try and reduce those as I continue moving forward. I can also see I'm completely dominating the conversation, which makes complete sense. I am the presenter at this time. I've spoken for 72% of this conversation, and it just gave me a little notice that I'm speaking a little fast. With Yoodli, you can have it running in the background on every single call. We're recording your voice and your voice only. And so I'm not infringing on anyone's privacy. I don't need to let people know that I'm using it. I get my own personalized speech coach powered by AI running in the background at all times. Now, at the end of the call, let's imagine we've just wrapped up. I stop. Yoodli pops up with a quick summary of how well I just performed. It'll say, hey, you had 1% fill words. Nice job. You had a few monologues. Keep an eye on that. And our pacing's a little slow. I think we broke it in our last build. We're an early stage startup. You all know the drill. It'll show me how fast I'm speaking. After using Yoodli for a bunch of calls, you can jump into the platform by either hitting See All Insights or going to the website. So I'm going to jump into See All Insights here. See exactly how you performed on your last conversation. So you can see I've got a transcript of everything that I said. There's a section where I paused and other people spoke. I believe that was Bobby. This is when you said, no, you have not seen Yoodli before. And you can see my transcript is littered with a few purple boxes. These boxes help me recognize where my speaking infractions occur. So when I hit analytics, I can look in to see where my filler words existed. Okay, cool. No real pattern here, just a few of them in and out as I'm trying to interact more frequently with audiences. Cool, that's a great learning for me. Next time when I'm interacting with audiences, I should be a little bit more confident, try and prepare a little bit more for that specific section. I have a few instances of repetition. These are similar to crutch words, weak words, words that make me seem less confident. If I look at my listening, I can see how many questions I asked. Should probably bump that up. 5 is not too bad though. How much time I spoke, which makes complete sense. And how fast I spoke. Good fluctuation. Ran away a little at the end. I need to slow down. Yoodli gives me all these insights on a speech-by-speech basis, combined with some cool stuff from our AI as well. Now, this is feedback that's generated by an LLM. Takes a second or two here. I'm pretty sure we're having issues with our PubSub model right now, which is why it's a little bit slower, but let me show you all what this looks like on a different speech. We'll give a quick highlight of key points. We'll help you understand ways you can rephrase a sentence. So it'll say, hey, Sharan, you said this. Here's a way you could say it to be more concise, easier to understand, and gives actionable feedback by suggesting a specific course of action when encountering repetitive mistakes. So reducing the frequency in which I use so. Now, Yoodli is really cool on an individual basis. I can see myself using this when I give a lot of presentations or when I'm on stage or when I'm delivering something like this. But what's really powerful is once you configure Yoodli, it sits in the background and helps you diagnose things over time. On our dashboard, you can understand trends, and these insights will pop up as well in, this just worked 20 minutes ago. It'll take a second or two here, I think. The insights that pop up at the bottom show you how you can perform different things in different manners. So for example, I start 7% of my sentences with the word I. Should probably keep an eye on that. I got 24 instances of where I need to slow down in the last 30 days. That's my Yoodli for desktop giving me a notification. Sharan, you're speaking too fast, slow down. And my filler word percentage was 6.8% higher when I used the Yoodli website to record. I'll show you what that means in a second. This probably means that I have a lot higher filler words when I'm practicing on the Yoodli app itself. You can see my filler word percentage over the last 30 days across all of my calls. Number of monologues shot up recently. Got to keep an eye on that. The number of questions asked has been decent, but should probably improve a little bit in my opinion. And I like to talk. Not too much, but a good amount. I'm able to recognize all of these and then take action. In my library, I can tag each speech, or Yoodli will automatically tag it for me. This will pop up in just a second, where I can see, hey, do I communicate differently in a presentation or a meeting with multiple people or a one-on-one? in my dashboard, I can make that same filter and say, hey, how do I communicate in a one-on-one? And apologies for the slowness. I think we're having an issue with our speed. We're working on that right now. I can see how well I communicate on a one-on-one and compare that to, say, a meeting or a presentation. I'm going to pause there. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I had a question. Is this only for English, or because I know different languages have different cadences, so I'm guessing you're only focusing on one language?
Yeah, great question. English for now. The goal is to get to a bunch of different languages in the future and expand out to different cultures. The focus for us is, hey, how do we crack this for English, specifically American-focused English? Because English in Australia, and Britain, and the UK is just very different. So that's our core focus. Once we fix the UX and the UI, we'll expand to different languages and different cultures and adapt the analytics for that matter. Great question.
Are there ways to change the targets? For example, if when speaking to a foreign audience in English, I may have to go even slower. So kind of reset the targets as to who the audience is. And is there a score for understandability? Because I tend to mumble, for example. So is that indicated anywhere?
Yeah, superb questions. Changing of the targets is not something that we can do quite yet. It's actually something that I brought up to the team yesterday, and we're working on a PRD to put that into place in the near future. With regards to the question around understandability, it's not a feature that we have direct today. Our AI comments, or our speech coaching does give some feedback on, hey, this is a sentence that you can improve on, using a few heuristics, using a few models in terms of like classifying something that's the most confusing and giving feedback there. And similarly, in a specific recording, excuse me, this is a recording I just made. For every single blurb, you can jump in and ask it to rephrase concisely or to rephrase in the simplest terms. So let's use an LLM to help you understand how you can rephrase a specific sentence to be a little bit better.
Because it could be connections to some of those services for writing where it says, it's good for a 12-year-old to understand versus a 20-year-old. There are those types of things based on written text that you could do a post process there, at least say that, this was kind of above their heads, so define target audience.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of fun stuff we want to do similar to that. That's a great suggestion. I'll have to write that down.
There was a question on the chat about which server the virtual data storage.
Yeah, great question, Jim. I'm assuming this question is privacy oriented. Data is stored on the cloud. We're a GCS company, so it's stored on Google Cloud Services. It's all end-to-end encrypted, similar to the way I like to explain it to non-technical people is it's very similar to Google Drive unless you want to explicitly share a speech, which you can do by hitting share and inviting people via email or link. Every bit of data is private. You own it, completely explicitly private to you. It's not locally stored. I know there's some companies out there like Rewind AI that store all of your data on your machine itself. Something that we're looking into in the future. Just right now, we're focused on building out the UX and the product. Does that answer, Jim? I'm going to assume yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Richard, I saw you unmuted. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Hey, Sharan. I had a question. So you mentioned that the service runs like in between sort of your machine and the Zoom application or whatever the application is.
Yeah.
Is it basically something that is always running and just kind of monitoring the mic? So I can switch between, I use like Slack, Huddles, Google Meet, I use Zoom sometimes, right? So there's a lot of different end applications where I'm using this. So like, how do you enable it? And does it just kind of passively working, right? Always listening to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Two things here. Actually, I'll talk about three just so there's context. So Yoodli is not always listening. Microphones are off. If you're curious about what devices are using your microphone, there's a little hack. You can look up audio MIDI, and this will show you which devices are actively using your microphone. So Teams is kind of sus. It's always listening, which is just interesting. But Yoodli will look for, there's two ways you can leverage Yoodli. One is by clicking Start Yoodli manually, and that exists by going to the desktop app and hitting Start Yoodli. The second is by integrating your calendar. And what we'll do is anytime you have a Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, or Zoom meeting, starting on your calendar will also auto start and will auto end at the end of your calendar events. You have the option to extend if your meeting's running long. That's one way of enabling Yoodli. And then the last way is what we call Smart Start Stop, which is just like you suggested, we'll be monitoring microphone activation. So whether you're on Slack Huddle, Teams, Meet, Zoom, anytime your microphone triggers to on, it'll give a little blurb and it'll say, hey, do you want to start Yoodli on this call? And you can hit start and it'll start up that way.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Super. I'm going to keep chugging along. A few more things I want to show you all. So Yoodli is really powerful in helping me diagnose specific problems. Let's imagine that I've recognized that I start 7% of my sentences with I. I just started my sentence with I, and I want to reduce that. Now, the best way to reduce things is by practice, and Yoodli's made it really easy for you to practice. Let's imagine that I have a specific reason I want to practice. I've got a job interview coming up. I'm looking for my next gig. Maybe it's a product role, and I want to ensure that I'm accurately and effectively conveying what I want to say. I can jump onto Yoodli, hit practice in the top left corner, hit interview, and you'll be greeted with our generative AI interview flow. So as you can probably guess, I can hit product management. And let's assume I'm interviewing with someone who's, I don't know, kind of mean. So there may be a stress interviewer. I'll hit stress interview. And from here, I can quickly go ahead and answer this question. I'm going to give a quick demo so y'all can see what this looks like. I'll do a quick 30 seconds here. Whew. So it really, it really depends on what the product is. If it's a product for the US market where I'm targeting high-end consumers, maybe people in the coasts, iOS is likely the best place to start just because the population of users on iOS is generally higher income and have a lot more disposable income. Versus if the population is meant for a broader mass market, maybe different parts of the world, maybe the BRIC nations, then maybe I'd consider launching on Android. So Yoodli will listen to what I said. It'll think, and it'll say, cool, how would you validate that iOS users in the US have higher disposable income compared to Android users? So a very pertinent question for me to practice. And this time I'm going to be very conscious about not using the word I. Yeah, absolutely. We can start by running surveys and looking at market research data, but also additionally, it makes a lot of sense when you talk to users. The best way to engage and learn things is by talking to users, blah, blah, blah. I can go on and on. I'm gonna hit stop. I think you all get the point. I hit save recording. That's a bug. I'm gonna report that to the team. Almost instantaneously, I'm greeted with those same analytics that I'm used to. That transcript is littered with all those filler words that I threw in there. My analytics. So I can see instances of repetition, no non-inclusiveness, filler words, weak words, and delivery. From here, I can keep an eye on how many times I use the word I. So as I scroll through, looks like I didn't have anything where I started the sentence with I. Awesome, good stuff, making progress. That's Yoodli in a nutshell. Happy to open up to more questions, happy to jam on ideas. Yeah, that's all I got.
Great presentation. I was wondering, so this is currently, I'm guessing, more of a B2C product, right? Like a consumer would use it. Wondering if you have any thoughts on like a B2B angle, because I guess I could imagine myself using it. I don't know how often I would such a platform, but I could see myself using it, but not super extensively. But on a business level, it could be really interesting for analytics on, your customer service reps or front-facing staff, hotel, reception staff. I could see that being really, really interesting. I'm wondering if y'all have taken a look at any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Short answer is yes. We're still super early stage. We're a seed company, 2 years old, 10 of us just trying to build something cool. We have taken this B2C approach and it's completely free for the time being, just so we can get feedback and iterate quickly on the UX and the design. Just because when we started, it was quite a challenge to envision what this could look like, how the interaction model should play out. we are starting early conversations on that specific space, the customer service, customer success, developer advocates, solution architect role, to see, hey, how can we help support these folks? One thing we're trying to bridge the gap between, though, is from a privacy standpoint and an employee privacy standpoint, to not be that big brother type of view, and ensure that they still have comfort for them to improve on their own while getting support from a manager or a leader in the organization. So trying to balance those two conflicting types of desires or needs, but slowly making progress. Great question, though. If you have suggestions too, happy to chat afterwards if you have ideas or people you think worth talking to about where this can fit in on a B2B play. Jim.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to find out what would be sort of really useful for me, and I guess for other people also, is if we could have a model. For example, let's say I want to speak like I don't know, Obama, and I could say, well, judge myself against his what he would say, so that the software would then come back and say, well, this is the way he would present it or whatever, and that way I could practice and change and things of that nature. Do you understand what I mean?
The reason I'm smiling so much is I made this exact suggestion last week to the team. If we could say, hey, I want to speak like Obama, can we start tailoring suggestions to become in that manner? I 100% agree with that approach. It's something that we're actively working on from a larger goal setting perspective. I mentioned at the start, it's hard for us to gauge what good speech is because everyone's goals are so different based on the types of conversations they're having, based on the environment in which a conversation is occurring. But we're starting to bridge that problem now. But I hear you loud and clear, Jim. I'm 100% aligned.
Hey, Sharan, I had another question.
Please.
So with the example that you said, you enunciated everything really clearly and really well. So the system was able to pick up everything, like every single word, and every single every single nuance there. So if someone has like a speech impediment, or if they slur a lot, is it still able to kind of bring value, or do you need to have a minimum threshold of enunciation for it to work better on you?
Yeah, great question. I don't have any technical numbers for you. What I can share is I have at least 10 to 15 calls a day with users around the world. I'd say 70% of our user base is international. And the stories I hear from our international folks are transcription's incredible. What they really like about it is there are instances where the pronunciation, their enunciation, the ways they're speaking don't actually get picked up by the system. But for them, that's actually really valuable to share, which is interesting because at first we're like, oh, that's a bug. We got to work on that. But they use that as a guidance to recognize, hey, I meant to say this, but the system didn't catch that. Interesting. That's proxy for my American colleagues not actually being able to catch that as well. And so for them, it's not actually necessarily an issue, more of an indication of here's some place you can work on improving your enunciation or your alliteration or whatever that may be. So there's
that's really interesting.
It's a weird answer to your question. I was in the same boat when I joined. I was like, oh shoot, we've got to like improve our model efficacy. We got to train it on different types of dialects, different types of different types of English. But talking to our users proved differently.
Yeah, I'll echo that. It's really interesting. So I'm actually from Singapore, and well, I guess two things, right? First, we have our own vernacular, like very, very different ways of pronouncing things, bits of other language mixed in. And the other thing is we speak the Queen's English, right? So we use the British way of speaking. And when I came to America, I had to learn how to speak in the American accent so people could understand me over calls. And that was, a big challenge. It took me many years to actually get right. So something like Yoodli, if it could help with that, I think would be very cool.
It's interesting because it's not an explicit feature. For all intents and purposes, without really talking to folks, it feels like a bug. But it's a cool outcome. Great question, Nikhil.
Awesome. I think Michael got some questions in the chat. You can quickly cover them.
Yeah. I've got like 3 minutes and then I've got to run, unfortunately. any educational system for students to better present themselves when engaging collaborative environments.
You were
Yes.
asking about where it could be used. So that was where I could see it being used.
Yeah, funny enough, I am speaking with a bunch of colleges next week for this exact integration and to collaborate with them at a deeper level. Colleges seem to be the best place for us to start, but I 100% agree that bringing it to educational systems across the page would be awesome. Any plans on sentiment analysis? I actually don't think I understand what you mean in
Mad,
terms
angry,
of
happy. Mad, angry, happy.
No plans on sentiment analysis. We haven't really found a problem that it would necessarily solve for our users. We haven't heard a request for that necessarily. It's an interesting topic. Do you have any ideas on what that could look like from your perspective, Michael?
I see a lot that comes up in things like call centers and stuff like that. If they can sense that a person is getting tense or stuff like that, then they can kind of help. You're like, hey, relax, take a breath. I have some uses in mostly I play in the media entertainment space for, film editorial, where I can see a lot of it. So.
Got it. Makes sense. Interesting. That's an interesting idea. I'm actually going to take that to the team as well. And then the last is, do you support a lexicon of expected spellings of people, places, and things? We do. We're slowly updating it. We're a quite small team, so there's not a ton in there.
Can a user add their own lexicon based on the meeting they're about to have?
Not quite, but that's also a great suggestion. I think one day we'd hope to get there. It's not something that's on the roadmap, but again, another excellent suggestion. Super.
Yeah, I know you have a call running, but this has been super engaging. You want to leave like any personal contact info in the chat so that folks who are interested in trying out Yoodli or want to connect with you can follow up afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. My email is sharan@yoodli.ai. I live in my superhuman, so I am constantly on email. So please shoot me an email. I'm also constantly on LinkedIn, so let me grab that too. Feel free to connect with me there. Yoodli's completely free. Give it a shot. I would love your thoughts, opinions, ideas. We're at the stage where we just want to talk to as many people as possible across a variety of different spans. And if it's even remotely interesting, I'd love if you could give it a shot and share your thoughts. You can ask James. I'm quite persistent about bugging for feedback. I have been with him, so it's a fun time.
Awesome, fantastic. Thanks, Sharan. I really appreciate you sharing your product, and then love to follow up soon.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Jay. I'm sorry I'm missing your presentation, but I hope it's a good one.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Jay,
y'all.
sharing the screen.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to be following up on I'm going to be doing public speaking after a public speaking startup, so that's going to be interesting. Hopefully I do a good job. But yeah, so it's going to be a bit of a change of pace. And maybe I'll do a short introduction of myself first. So yeah, I'm Jay. I'm a co-founder of a company called Eventual. We are building a DataFrame library called Daft. That's DAFT. If you're familiar with what the word daft means, it's interesting. I was in London and people were very hesitant to call us daft because daft actually means somewhere in the realm of between silly and stupid. It's very commonly used that way in the UK. But yeah, we just wanted, processing of complex multimodal type data to be simple. And that's one of the motivations for calling it daft. So a little bit of introduction of myself. So before Eventual, I was actually a software lead at a company called Freenome, which does biotech. So a lot of genomic data, like autoantibody data, proteomics data for patients, DNA data, and trying to predict cancer from all these biomarkers. And then afterwards, I went to Lyft Level 5, which was their autonomous driving division before it was bought by Toyota. Over there, I built on the distributed data systems for machine learning on data types such as LiDAR, images, radar, again, very multimodal. Actually, one of our main contributions was a multimodal deep learning model that was able to combine information from across all these different modalities. So yeah, I've been building these data systems for machine learning, specifically multimodal machine learning, for quite a while. and started realizing that the tabular world is fairly mature, right? You have all these systems that are SQL-based. You're able to query tables of data really easily, but all of a sudden, when you get to multimodal data with like images and video and audio and weird tensors, weird compressions, weird file formats, things start to get really messy. And when I was looking for my next stint after we were sold to Toyota, me and my co-founder, Sammy, we realized that a whole bunch of places was just asking us to build the same thing over again, which was, hey, we have a bunch of videos, hey, we have a bunch of images, hey, we have a bunch of PDFs. Please build a data system around it so we can do machine learning, so that we can do analytics, so that we can build a product around it. And that kind of led us to this epiphany that, hey, there should be a better abstraction, a better way for people to work with this type of data. And that's what led us to build Daft. And that's what I'm presenting about today. And hopefully that's going to be interesting for all of you. So before we start, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we call complex data, but people might understand it as either unstructured data or multimodal data, and kind of give a good overview of what that really means, right? So I think oftentimes people tend to draw this really strict division between structured and unstructured data. But structured data is things that you can put into an Excel spreadsheet, right? So think things like strings, text, small bits of text, numbers, dates. And then all of a sudden, when you go to things like images, you think more in terms of folders and files, right? You have a folder full of files, and they're not in a table anymore, but it's just a bunch of files sitting around. But we think that it's a bit of a false dichotomy, and really we should be thinking of data more on this spectrum of like primitive to complex. And if you're a programmer, this will be very intuitive for you, because on the primitive end, you have very atomic data types like numbers, integers, floats, right? The string foo or the Boolean true. But when you want to start expressing more complex concepts, you put these primitives together into these data structures that all of a sudden take on meaning. So now maybe you have a geographical latitude, longitude coordinate, right? That's just two floats, but once you put them together, it means something different. Or you have a person represented by a name, which is a string, and an age, which is an integer. And now it becomes a bit more complex, right? And how do we then think about an image? An image isn't anything magical. It's really just a buffer of pixel values, uint8, right? And a height and a width. So it's really not all that different from the latitude and longitude and the person example. So this is, I guess, some idea of what we mean when we talk about complex data. But let's talk a little bit more specifically, what makes data complex and why is working with complex data hard? Well, first of all, it's just a lot more data per item, right? An image, for example, will have maybe up to 1 million pixels versus if you have a number, it's just, one number, right? So by having that much more data, you also actually require a lot more compute in order to process the data. So both data size and compute is problematic. Second of all, when we have complex data types, they're often very domain specific. So you have images, video, geospatial, and these often require very specific, expert-oriented, domain-specific functions to run. For example, on a latitude longitude, you might ask, what is the zip code, right, of this particular address? And most engines out there don't have this prepackaged and ready to use. So it would be hard to do this, for example, in a SQL engine. And third of all, complex data is very hard to represent. The folks from 12 Labs here will tell you that video is very hard. All these weird encodings and ways you have to treat the data in order to actually even start doing anything with it, right? And so the solutions that we see people work with on the primitive end, you have SQL, but once you get to the complex end, you start having these giant systems that run big batch workloads, and you manage job queues, and you have all these different Python dependencies and C++ dependencies, and it's a huge mess. But the way that we think about it is why can't there just be one framework for it, right? Why can't we just have one framework to work with both primitive and complex data? And that's what Daft essentially is endeavoring to do. The basic idea here is you can have columns that are of complex types. So we have tensor columns, we have image columns, we have bytes columns, URL columns, etc. And that helps you work really effectively with native operations on your complex types. So I guess before we jump into the demo, 4 main things that Daft is providing: familiar DataFrame interface. So if you've ever worked with a table, right, it's just rows and columns. You can do joins, you can do aggregations, group by, all that fun stuff. It has a very expressive typing system. So we have rich types such as images, tensors. We're working on some things like audio, and URLs are also really powerful in Daft. We'll showcase some of that later. And then a lot of the operations, when they actually run in Rust, because we have Python as the API, but Rust is the underlying execution engine, which lets us run very, very efficiently. Third of all, we have powerful Python native UDFs. And so if you ever need to drop into Python, which is pretty common, to run models or the like, it's very easy to do in Daft and very native. And last of all, we're distributed. So once you reach a certain data size, you're now, instead of processing 1,000 images, you're doing like 10 million. And that's where going distributed really makes sense. So it's demo time. Just decided to keep this demo a little bit shorter today, but we will be using Daft to process this data set that I've kind of just curated using FFmpeg on a Disney short. I don't know if any of you have watched this short. But yeah, basically what I've done is I've taken a video, used FFmpeg to break it into frames, and now we're gonna do some fun stuff with the frames, right? So Daft allows you to read lots of different types of data. So for tabular data formats, if your data is in table form, for example, CSVs, Parquets, JSON, we allow loading that, no surprise. But we also work really well with the quote unquote unstructured data case, right? Where you just have files on disk. And in this case, I just have a bunch of JPEGs in my local folder. I load it in, and when I tell Daft to execute, it loads in this data frame, which is a bunch of file paths. Right? You'll notice that like they have numbers. This is the frame number. I sampled 1 frame per second. And then so very simple, very easy to load this type of data. The second thing that Daft makes it really easy to do is work really well with URLs. Right? Oftentimes you have these tables with URLs pointing out to either your disk or cloud storage, AWS S3, GCS, what have you. With Daft, downloading is a simple one line right here. You just call .url.download, and that brings you from your string column, right, path to a bytes column. Now we have a new column here called image that's of a binary type. And then now we want to go one step further. We know that this binary, they're JPEGs, and we want to decode it into an image type, right? Again, one-liner, we have a little helper here, a little expression to bring you into the image. And notice that nothing's actually run right now because Daft is lazy. And so when you run it, Daft will automatically fuse these two operations together, make them really, really fast. We have a lot of cool query optimization that goes on under the hood. And when you collect it, it just loads in all the images. And you'll notice that there's a lot of repeats because, I sampled 1 frame per second, and the first part of this movie is kind of static. And so what we can do now is, what I want to do is maybe I want to sample instead 1 frame every 10 seconds, right? How do we do that? So for this, I'm going to drop down into Python. I want to parse this path here and get this number right here, right? This tells me the frame number. And if I were to do this in Python, it'd be pretty simple. I do a split on this slash, and then I grab this number and convert it to an integer. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. With Daft, it makes it really easy to run Python on your data frame. This is the Python function I'm trying to run. I had it in one line. I just splattered it and say like, hey, Daft, apply this Python function on my column. And then I'm going to filter for rows that have every 10 rows, basically, grab 1 frame every 10 rows. And that's what we get. And now we have much more varied data across the entire short. And so the pattern you start noticing when you work with this type of data is that, yes, you work with the complex data, but at the same time, a lot of times the metadata really, really matters, right? What frame number was this? And then you want to start deriving more metadata too, to make your data set rich enough to work with. For example, in this case, you could be curious, hey, how many people are in each frame? Can I only get frames with more people, right? With 2 people, for example. And so that's exactly what I've done. I wrote a little function here. This runs YOLO using an open source tool that I found. Nothing too fancy. It runs the YOLO algorithm and returns me predictions of, first of all, the classes, what type of object is in the image, and second of all, the bounding box of those objects. And after running this function, we run it in what's called a user-defined function, or UDF. you wrap it in the UDF, and you call it on your column, just like you would call a Python function. Once you run it, we get these results. And these are all, notice that this is a Python type column. I've defined it as a Python type column. And so these are actually just Python dictionaries, super flexible. And when you're ready, you can kind of break it out and work with it in a kind of Daft native way. And so I can break it out into these Daft types, which are lists. So you'll notice that for every image now, we have a list of the type of the object in the image. So there's a bottle in there somewhere, very small. And also the boxes for those objects. And now I'm going to do crops, right? I want to understand, oh, well, actually, first of all, I promised y'all we're going to filter for only rows with more than 2 people. So that's very simple to do. I wrote a little custom Python function here to count the number of people per row. And then we're going to do a filter, right? Where the number of people per row is more than equal to 2. And so now we'll see that all the images, ta-da, we have, this image with the guy standing next to the lady, and then 2 people here, many people here working at the desks. And so this allows you to iterate really quickly and start deriving these insights from your complex type data, but at the same time, work in this tabular data format, iterate really fast. I'm going to speed ahead right here. We're going to explode the row so that we now have 1 object per row instead of 1 image per row. And then we're going to do a crop. I just wrote this. We're going to push it up in our next release, which is image.crop. Oh, oops. Am I using the wrong version of Daft? 1 second. My bad. The perils of live demos. Okay. I will have to rerun this because I was actually running on the development version of Daft. Let's see if my image crop now will run for me. Cool. Yeah, so now we have these crops, 1 per row. And then we also have a resize operator. So that's something you often want to do for machine learning, get them all to the same size. Now we have these nice little images, 1 per size. You could do other things such as throw them into tensors and all that. And then, yeah, ultimately, you probably want to save it somewhere, use it for machine learning downstream. So that's Daft in a nutshell running locally. But one thing that really makes it stand out is if you are using Ray, which is a distributed computing framework, you can just connect Daft to your Ray cluster, and all of a sudden now, instead of running on my laptop like I've been doing, you can run Daft on 1,000 CPU cores or 64 GPUs, and that makes it really easy to scale up that way. So that was it for the demo. A little bit about some of the roadmap. We are working on a lot of integrations with data catalogs, so things like Iceberg, Delta Lake, if you're using any of those. We're working on a massive I/O performance increases. We've seen performance for downloading from URLs, downloading from specifically Parquet files, CSV files, go up by factors of like 5 to 10x with some of the stuff we've been doing in Rust. And that really actually is some of the most expensive work. Just downloading the images from the cloud is usually very expensive. And the last thing is, yeah, we'll be building more types. Haven't had time to work on a video type yet. So if anyone's interested in collaborating, hint, come get in touch. And that's it for the demo and the presentation. Happy to take any questions. I see some questions. Can it reduce images by similarity? Yes. So one thing so some of our other demos have demonstrated similarity search, and the way it's pretty simple to do. You just run a simple model to reduce each image into an embedding, and then you can do a simple cosine search across the embeddings. We actually do have an embedding type, but we have not integrated cosine similarity functionality. The one thing we don't have is what's called an outer join, right? Because oftentimes what you want to do is you want to do a pairwise comparison of every image to every other image. And in order to do that, you kind of need this outer join to do that. But yeah, checking for similarity is very simple to do. And there are many different metrics you might want to use for that. You might use an embedding-based method. You might do a heuristic-based method like what I did here, just grab me images with 2 people. That is a similarity metric in some respects. Yeah. And I guess the second question, I don't know what blip2 is. Michael, could you maybe elaborate? What is blip2 for the caption service?
I don't know what it is, but I know how to use it. I can put a link in the chat of the little playground that I use. You can just upload an image and ask it questions, or it'll generate captions for you.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, so making a API call in Daft is very easy. So, you know, if you have videos or images in 12 Labs or in any other framework, you can have URLs and stuff in Daft, and you can make API calls from Daft into that service if you want to make use of compute in that service. It's replicate, I see. It's just like a model endpoint, I'm guessing. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question, but making an API call from Daft is very simple. Just run a Python UDF.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any burning question from the audience that you have? I'm curious about the sort of so I think one of the slides you mentioned about the 4 communities, right? Of the
yes,
yeah. Which one out of this seems to be the hardest to achieve?
Yeah, so going distributed is really difficult. Technically, you can do most of what we do in Daft on a local environment with pandas. You know, if you have Python and pandas, you're pretty good for small data sets. But because we're dealing with multimodal data that often requires a lot more compute and a lot more memory, going distributed is almost a strict requirement for a lot of workloads. And when you go into a distributed world, a distributed join is very different from a local join. It requires a lot of optimizations around network shuffling, I/O, and intelligent optimizations around how we do the joins and the sorts and all that stuff. So distributed is really difficult. But doing stuff locally is very simple. The rest, I would say, are mostly API focused, right? It gives you a good API, and also we provide some common operations for working with these complex types that we're constantly building up. But yeah, those are, I think, mostly not as difficult to build out if you were trying to build this on your own. We've seen a lot of companies build their own internal kind of janky DataFrame thing that works really well locally on pandas, but then once they need to scale up, it gets very tricky.
Awesome. So in this spectrum from primitive to complex data types, I guess where do you see the video modality fits?
On the extreme end, all the way on the complex side for sure. Way more complex than say images too, right? There's a lot of things you want to do for video. For example, when you have, let's imagine this data frame was a data frame of videos, right? What you want to do actually is you want to keep the URLs around and not materialize the video. And your video operations will be something like, you know, dot sample from certain range to certain range with certain frequency. And then you're making these API calls to pull down just the data you need and decompressing them in memory. Otherwise, your memory is just going to blow up. And that's the challenge with working with complex data types, is that oftentimes the encodings and the way you work with this data is very nuanced, and video is definitely more nuanced than even, you know, images, because that's that temporal dimension to it. Yeah, so we actually don't have any video functionality right now because it's fairly involved. So we're starting with the images first, which is a prerequisite because we want to be able to sample the images from the video. So we'll get there, but yeah.
That makes sense. I had a question following up from that, because as soon as you get into video, it's a whole different, it's another dimension that you kind of have to worry about. Have you ever tried working on with like those 360 videos? And I was curious like how that would work within Daft? Because those things are also MP4 files.
So I haven't worked on 360 videos, but at Lyft we were working with cameras with multiple angles that covers a 360 view, and there are these algorithms that will stitch it into a 360 panoramic view, and you do a lot of normalization to kind of have that all be one long view. And what you can do also is you record all the different angles. Like the coordinate system you use is very different, because then you're using polar coordinates to represent each section. And so you have this complete 360 view instead of XY coordinate. So that is interesting. But yeah, you would basically have to run custom algorithms to perhaps download 6 files and then do that. Because in that case, the video dimension is kind of, yeah, that's interesting. Even in the 6 camera view, it's kind of a video, because you have each image comes at a different frequency, right? So you can almost treat it like a video then. But the algorithms are very, very specialized to do all that stitching and to make sure that the temporal consistency is correct across all these views.
So it could be normalized and then treated just like a regular video. I saw in like one of the documents which James sent was like a audio file as an example. What can you do with Daft with audio?
Not anything yet. We're still looking for partners who want to collaborate. But with audio, it's a whole different challenge, because audio is all about ranges, and you want to be able to do kind of the same thing with videos too. Don't materialize the whole thing. You will query for a given range, and then you can do things such as understand metrics like how many speakers are speaking in a given segment, right? Give me all segments where only one speaker was speaking, or you can even do audio tagging and understand like this is speaker 1, speaker 2, and all this kind of fun stuff to pre-process your data. So the way I would think about Daft is you have all this messy, complex data types coming in at the top of your funnel, right? Things that, for Yoodli, for example, they'll have all these little clips that they've recorded, and it's all dumped in AWS S3 somewhere. And then you want to kind of go from that into a more derived, sensible format, which you can run analytics and queries and understand that data over. And you might want to get rid of all sections where people are talking over each other, where there's complete silence. You might want to get rid of that. And so those are a lot of the audio operations you might want to do.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So for example, like what I did here was I sample images from the video. In audio, you will probably sample ranges and kind of use that as your heuristic to grab data that you can then use downstream in an easier fashion.
If images are a better use case for the demo, because it's fun to see the exact simple cuts. It wouldn't have been as interesting.
Easy to visualize. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is why we usually use images, but we think of everything that's not primitive as kind of complex. So a lot of our users actually, they just work with like protobufs. Protobufs are fairly difficult to work with. Or you have JSONs, protobufs, you have weird formatted CSVs. They're all fairly complex too, but it doesn't make for as pretty of a demo.
Great. Maybe one final question before we conclude is that I mean, this is an open source project, and I'm also part of your Slack community on distributed data frame, right? Maybe can you talk a bit about developing an open source library? How do you think about prioritizing features and getting feedback from the community and that process of iterating? And
yeah, that's really interesting, because as an open source project, I wouldn't put ourselves in the same bucket as something like Pandas or Polars. I don't know if anyone's heard of Polars. They've been making the news recently, but these are very, I guess, individual developer facing libraries that you can spin up, run on like a small CSV. The Daft use case is very different, right? The main reason you would use Daft is because you've kind of gotten to a scale where Polars and Pandas and all these libraries no longer work for you. And you now need to graduate to, I need to be able to run my 1 million images. And so building that kind of open source project is very different from building, say, a front-end framework or local DataFrame framework. And that experience has been really interesting because we end up collaborating a lot more with just companies and directly with companies. And so we don't generate, I would say, our focus is not so much on like stars or Twitter followings or, making posts on LinkedIn. That's really not the focus. The focus has primarily been on how many large workloads can we power for our large customers, right? A lot more enterprise facing open source. And so I will put ourselves in the same bucket as companies such as Databricks, such as Tabular with Iceberg, the data warehouse companies like Snowflake. Snowflake's not open source. They have some open source components, but you get the idea, kind of more in that realm of the enterprise.
Makes sense. I guess on final technical question is, can you talk about like the reason to build the project under the Rust programming language? Maybe
yes,
who are less familiar with it.
So originally everything was built in Python and Daft. And when working with these complex types, Python gets very difficult to work with. For a couple of reasons. One of the main ones is just memory management. Memory management is probably the most important thing in large-scale distributed systems. Because when you're working with this data, you want to avoid too many copies of data. You want to control very finely when the system purges data and allocates data memory. Otherwise, these images, when they come in, you decompress them, they go from like 100 kilobytes, they go 20x, right? So being able to very finely control the allocations of data was crucial. And we needed something lower level than Python for that, because Python's a garbage collected language and it's very difficult to control. I think the simple example that we usually give is the pill library. Did you know, for example, that when you do pill.load, when you load an image, it doesn't load the image, it just loads the path. And only when you tell it to do something, then it loads the image, right? And so not having fine-grained control around kind of the underlying data representation in memory is very difficult for us to work with these complex types without having a lower level abstraction such as that we can build in Rust.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of popular open source library in the space lately that leverage Rust, like Qdron and LessDB is probably the two I'm most familiar with. So it seems like there's definitely a technical reason behind that, right?
Yeah, it's definitely growing in popularity. I would say if you're using Python, the Rust Python bindings are amazing. If you've ever used the Rust C++ bindings, it's way better than that. So that's also probably one reason why we've seen a kind of and large increase in the projects that are Python API plus Rust under the hood, just because the developer experience has been really amazing so far.
Gotcha. Awesome. So we about 3 minutes over time, yeah, thanks a lot, Jay, for walking a deep dive presentation about the library as well, a demo of the notebook. I added a bunch of documentation and GitHub links as well as the community links in the chat for those who are interested in learning more about the project and the community that Jay and his co-founder Sami has started. So yeah, and this email as well. Well, thanks everyone for showing up today again, and had a really great engaging webinars. Two very different talks in different aspects. But I hope you have fun, and yeah, thanks to speakers, and the recording will be available by mid next week. Yeah, hope you all enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, folks.